A 78-year-old Buddhist monk just told me something that shattered everything I thought I knew about human suffering. He grabbed my wrist, looked me straight in the eyes, and whispered, "Most people spend their entire lives in a prison where the door was never actually locked." I stared at him, confused. Then he asked me a question that haunts me to this day. What if the heaviest burdens you carry aren't even real? What if that exhaustion crushing your spirit, that hollow feeling in your chest, that sense that life is passing you by, what if none of it has to exist? Here's what he meant. Right now, you're carrying invisible weights that are slowly suffocating your soul. The belief that you're too old to change, toxic people who drain your energy, clutter that represents every choice you regret, the terror of aging, the desperate need for others to validate your worth. But here's the shocking truth this monk revealed. Every single one of these burdens is optional. Not one of them is permanent. And the keys to release them have existed for over 2,500 years. In the next hour, I'm sharing 8 profound Buddhist stories that will show you exactly how to set down what you were never meant to carry. These aren't abstract concepts, they're practical keys used by real people who went from feeling trapped to feeling genuinely free. You'll meet the scholar who thought he knew everything until a tea ceremony humbled him into wisdom. The dancer who feared aging until she discovered something more beautiful than youth. The warrior who compared himself to young fighters until he found his true strength. If even one of these stories hits you like lightning, drop one word in the comments, the heaviest thing you're ready to release. Not for me, but as your declaration of freedom. Ready to unlock the prison door you didn't know was open. Teaching 1. Let go of the belief that there's nothing left to learn. Master Chen was the most feared intellectual in ancient China. At 65, he had memorized over 10,000 Buddhist sutras, debated emperors, and crushed every scholar who dared challenge his knowledge. His reputation was legendary. Monks traveled for months just to hear him speak, and his interpretations of sacred texts were considered gospel. But here's what nobody knew. Master Chen was dying inside. Despite his vast knowledge, he felt completely empty. Every morning, he'd wake up with a crushing sense of hollowness, like he was performing wisdom instead of living it. His mind was stuffed with information, but his heart felt barren. He had become a walking encyclopedia with a dying soul. Then whispers reached him about a simple mountain monk who had never read a single text, yet people claimed he possessed profound wisdom. Chen was insulted. How could an illiterate peasant understand what he, with decades of study, had mastered? His ego demanded investigation. When Chen arrived at the humble temple, he found the old monk tending vegetables. The monk looked up, smiled warmly, and said something that sent chills down Chen's spine. "Ah, brother, I've been expecting you. You've traveled so far to get here." How could he have been expecting him? They'd never met. The monk invited him for tea. Chen couldn't contain himself. He immediately began showing off his intellectual prowess. For 20 minutes straight, he quoted complex passages, explained intricate philosophical points, and demonstrated his superior understanding. It was a masterclass in scholarly arrogance. The old monk listened patiently, occasionally nodding. When Chen finally paused for breath, the monk began pouring tea into his guest's cup. He poured slowly, deliberately. The cup filled. The monk kept pouring. Tea overflowed onto the table. Still, he poured. Hot tea splashed onto the floor, creating a growing puddle. "Stop," Chen shouted. "The cup is completely full, no more will go in." The monk gently set down the teapot and looked directly into Chen's eyes. "Yes," he said quietly, "and like this cup, you are so full of your own knowledge that nothing new can enter. How can I show you wisdom when there's no space left in you to receive it?" The words hit Chen like a physical blow. In that moment, he saw himself clearly for the first time in decades. All his certificates, memorized texts, and intellectual achievements had become a prison. He had confused accumulating information with gaining wisdom. This is the essence of what Buddhists call Shoshin, beginner's mind. The great Zen master Suzuki Roshi taught that in the beginner's mind there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind there are few. When we believe we already know everything, we stop seeing, stop growing, stop discovering the magic hidden in ordinary moments. Chen's transformation began with a single, humble question: "Master, how do I empty my cup?" The monk's answer revolutionized everything. "The same way you filled it, one drop at a time. But instead of adding more knowledge, start subtracting certainty. Instead of collecting answers, begin collecting wonder." This touched on the Buddhist teaching of upadana, attachment. Chen had become attached not just to his knowledge, but to his identity as the one who knows. This attachment was suffocating his natural curiosity and joy. The monk gave Chen a daily practice that changed his life. Each morning, before studying anything, Chen had to sit quietly and ask himself 3 questions. What don't I know today? What might surprise me? How can I see this familiar world with fresh eyes? At first, Chen's ego violently resisted. His mind kept wanting to show off, to prove its superiority. But gradually, something miraculous began happening. When he stopped trying to be the smartest person in every conversation, he started actually hearing what others were saying. When he released his need to have all the answers, he discovered questions he'd never even imagined. The transformation was profound. Chen spent 3 years with the mountain monk, not learning new doctrines, but unlearning his attachments to old certainties. He discovered that true wisdom isn't about knowing more. It's about remaining open to wonder, surprise, and the possibility that everything you think you understand might be just the beginning. Think about your own life right now. When did you last feel genuinely curious about something? When did you last allow yourself to be a complete beginner, fumbling and learning and discovering like a child? The Buddha taught that everything in existence is constantly changing, including your capacity for growth and understanding. Here's what's revolutionary about this teaching: your age is irrelevant. Whether you're 25 or 85, your mind still has infinite capacity for wonder. The problem isn't that you're too old to learn, it's that you've convinced yourself the learning is over. Chen eventually returned to his scholarly life, but everything was different. Instead of teaching from arrogance, he taught from humility. Instead of giving students answers, he helped them discover their own questions. His students said something fundamental had shifted in his presence. He felt more alive, more vibrant, more genuinely wise. The Buddhist concept of anicca, impermanence, reminds us that we are constantly changing. The person you were this morning is not the person you are right now. So why should your growth ever stop? Chen lived to 94, and his students said he grew more curious, more wonder-filled with each passing year. He had discovered Buddhism's most beautiful secret: the lotus doesn't bloom once and stay open forever. It opens fresh each morning, responding to each new day's light. So let me challenge you. What if your greatest discoveries are still ahead of you? What if approaching today with beginner's mind could unlock possibilities you never imagined? Because when you empty your cup of false certainty, you create infinite space for real wisdom to pour in. And that openness to learning reveals something else. It shows you who in your life supports your growth and who might be holding you back. Teaching 2. Let go of toxic relationships without guilt. In ancient Japan, there lived a gentle monk named Tanzen, whose compassionate nature made him beloved by everyone, except one person. His fellow monk, Bucko, seemed to take sadistic pleasure in making Tanzen's life miserable. Every single day, Bucko would find new ways to torment him. He'd criticize Tanzen's meditation posture in front of others, mock his sincere questions during teachings, assign him the monastery's most degrading chores while claiming it was for his spiritual development. Worst of all, he'd do it with a smile, making Tanzen question his own perceptions. For 3 agonizing years, Tanzen endured this treatment because he believed something many of us believe: that spiritual people must accept all behavior, that setting boundaries means lacking compassion, that walking away makes you a bad person. Tanzen was slowly dying inside. His natural joy withered. His meditation became forced. He began avoiding other monks because he felt too broken to connect authentically. But still, he told himself this was his spiritual test, that enlightened beings should endure anything with patience. Everything changed the day Tanzen collapsed during evening prayers. The monastery's wise abbot, Master Shaun, found him weeping in the temple garden. For the first time, Tanzen poured out his story: the daily humiliations, the constant criticism, the way Bucko seemed to drain his very life force. Master Shaun listened in complete silence. When Tanzen finished, the abbot walked to a beautiful flowering tree and pointed to a twisted vine wrapped around its trunk, slowly strangling it. "Tanzen," he said gently, "do you see how this tree struggles to bloom?" "Yes, Master." "And do you see the parasitic vine that feeds off its life force?" Tanzen nodded, suddenly understanding where this was going. "Tell me," Master Shaun continued, "would it be compassionate for the gardener to leave this vine, allowing it to slowly kill this magnificent tree? Or would true compassion require removing the parasite to save both the tree and the garden's beauty?" The words hit Tanzen like lightning. He had been so focused on being good that he'd forgotten the Buddhist teaching of metta loving-kindness that includes love for yourself. But the abbot wasn't finished. "There's something else, young monk. What happens to the vine when it finally kills its host?" "It dies too," Tanzen whispered. "Exactly. When we allow others to treat us poorly, we're not helping them, we're enabling their destructive patterns. Sometimes the most compassionate thing we can do is refuse to participate in someone else's cruelty." This reveals the profound Buddhist understanding of right relationship, one of the Noble Eightfold Path's essential elements. Right relationship doesn't just mean being kind to others. It means creating connections that allow all beings to flourish, including yourself. Master Shaun taught Tanzen about the Buddhist principle of upaya, skillful means. Sometimes love looks gentle and accepting. Other times, love looks like firm boundaries. The skillful person knows which approach serves the highest good. But Master, Tanzan asked, won't setting boundaries make me selfish? Won't I be abandoning my spiritual practice? The abbot smiled. Tell me, when you're constantly drained and demoralized, how much genuine compassion can you offer others? When your own spirit is crushed, what do you have left to give? This touched on Buddhism's airplane oxygen mask principle. You cannot truly serve others from an empty vessel. Self-care isn't selfish, it's the foundation for authentic service. The next morning, when Bucko began his usual verbal assault, Tanzan did something revolutionary. He looked directly into Bucko's eyes and said calmly, I will no longer participate in conversations that diminish either of us. If you wish to speak with me respectfully, I am here. If not, I will remove myself with love. Bucko was stunned. He'd grown comfortable having someone to dominate, and Tanzan's boundary completely disrupted his pattern. He tried guilt, manipulation, even enlisted other monks to pressure Tanzan into returning to his old doormat behavior. But Tanzan had tasted freedom, and he couldn't unknow what peace felt like. Here's what's beautiful about this story. Tanzan didn't become cold or bitter. Instead, he channeled his recovered energy into helping younger monks who were struggling. He spent time with brothers who appreciated his gentle nature instead of exploiting it. His natural compassion flourished when it was no longer being constantly depleted. The Buddhist concept of Sangha, spiritual community, teaches us that we are meant to be surrounded by people who support our highest good, not tear us down. When we cling to relationships that diminish us, we are practicing a form of attachment that creates suffering for everyone involved. 6 months later, something unexpected happened. Bucko approached Tanzan with genuine humility. I've been reflecting on your words, he admitted. I realize I've been acting from my own pain and I've hurt you. Can you teach me how to speak with more kindness? They slowly rebuilt their relationship, with Tanzan maintaining clear boundaries and Bucko learning to respect them. But here's the crucial part. Tanzan told other monks he would have been at peace even if Bucko had never changed, because he'd learned that his worth wasn't dependent on others' approval. The Zen master Huang Po taught, your everyday mind, that is the way. This means protecting your peace of mind isn't selfishness, it's spiritual practice. When we allow toxic relationships to persist, we're not being virtuous, we're being unconscious. Think about your own relationships right now. Is there someone who consistently leaves you feeling drained, criticized, or diminished? Are you holding onto connections out of obligation rather than genuine love? The Buddha's teaching on dukkha, suffering, reminds us that we often create unnecessary pain by clinging to relationships that no longer serve anyone's highest good. True love sometimes requires creating space. This doesn't mean cutting people off harshly. It means making conscious choices about where you invest your precious life energy. Sometimes it means having difficult conversations. Sometimes it means setting firm boundaries. And yes, sometimes it means walking away with love. As Tanzan later became a respected teacher, he would tell his students, the sun doesn't apologize for shining, and you don't need to apologize for protecting your light. When you honor your own peace, you give others permission to do the same. But protecting yourself from toxic people is just one type of boundary you need to create. Because sometimes the heaviest weight we carry isn't other people's negativity. It's our own inability to let go of things that no longer serve us. In the mountains of Tibet, there stood an ancient monastery famous for its vast library and priceless artifacts. The head librarian, Monk Pema, had spent 30 years accumulating what he considered spiritual treasures, rare texts, sacred statues, ceremonial bowls, and gifts from countless devotees. His quarters overflowed with items he deemed essential, each carrying a story he couldn't bear to forget. But Pema's burden went far deeper than physical possessions. He carried emotional clutter too, every harsh word spoken to him, every mistake he'd made in 3 decades, every moment of doubt about his worthiness. His mind had become like his cluttered room, stuffed with worries about the monastery's future, regrets about his past, and endless mental conversations that never reached resolution. Pema was drowning in his own accumulation, but he called it devotion. Everything changed when political upheaval forced the monastery to relocate. The devastating news came with an impossible condition. Each monk could take only what fit in a single traveling bag. Pema stared at his overflowing quarters in absolute panic. How could he possibly choose what to keep from a lifetime of collecting? That night, unable to sleep, he wandered to the meditation hall where he found the monastery's ancient teacher, Master Nobu, sitting in perfect stillness. "Master," Pema whispered, his voice breaking, "how can I decide what to keep? Everything seems important. These texts contain wisdom. These statues represent devotion. These gifts honor those who gave them. How do I choose what matters?" Master Nobu opened his eyes slowly and smiled with infinite compassion. "Come with me, dear Pema." He led the distraught monk to the monastery's well. "When you draw water from this well, do you take the bucket or the water?" "The water, of course," Pema replied, confused by the simple question. "And when you study our sacred texts, do you take the paper and ink, or do you take the wisdom?" "The wisdom, Master, but I don't understand." "Then you already know how to choose," Master Nobu said gently. "Everything you truly need is already within you. The rest are just containers, useful for a time, but not essential for the journey." This teaching illuminated the Buddhist concept of anicca, impermanence. The Buddha taught that our attachment to material things causes suffering because everything in the physical world is temporary. But Master Nobu was pointing to something even deeper. "Tell me, Pema," the master continued, "why do you really keep all these things?" As Pema examined his motivations honestly, he realized the painful truth. He kept the texts because he feared forgetting important teachings. He hoarded the statues because he worried about appearing less devoted than other monks. He clutched the gifts because releasing them felt like betraying the giver's trust. "Ah," Master Nobu nodded knowingly. "Now we see the real clutter." In Buddhist psychology, we recognize 3 types of accumulation that weigh down the human spirit: physical, emotional, and mental. You carry all 3, and they're preventing you from experiencing the freedom that Buddhism promises. The master explained that physical clutter often reflects inner emptiness. We fill our spaces with objects hoping they'll fill the void in our hearts. But the Buddhist teaching of aparigraha non-possessiveness shows us that true fullness comes from appreciating without needing to own. "Pick up that prayer bowl," Master Nobu instructed. "Feel its weight, appreciate its beauty Understand its purpose. Now set it down. Notice that your appreciation doesn't require possession. Next, they addressed Pema's emotional clutter. Tell me about a hurt you've been carrying, the master said gently. Pema shared about a harsh criticism from a visiting teacher years earlier that still echoed in his mind. Now Master Nobu continued, "Can you see how holding onto this pain is like carrying a burning coal? The person who hurt you has forgotten and moved on, but you keep burning yourself with the memory." This revealed the Buddhist understanding that emotional clutter, old resentments, replayed hurts, accumulated grievances, creates ongoing suffering long after the original event has passed. The Buddha taught that holding onto anger is like grasping a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. You are the one who gets burned. Finally, they explored Pema's mental clutter, the endless stream of worried thoughts about tomorrow, regretful thoughts about yesterday, and judgmental thoughts about today. Watch your breath, Master Nobu instructed. Notice how you don't need to think about breathing for it to happen. Most of our thoughts are like this: automatic, unnecessary, and often burdensome. This points to the Zen concept of mushin no mind, a state where consciousness is free from random thoughts, judgments, and mental noise. Over the following weeks, Master Nobu guided Pema through a systematic decluttering process that transformed his entire existence. For physical clutter, Pema learned to ask, "Does this item serve a genuine purpose in my life today, or am I keeping it from fear, guilt, or attachment to the past?" He discovered that most of his possessions were emotional security blankets rather than practical necessities. For emotional clutter, he practiced Tonglen taking and giving meditation, transforming old resentments into compassion. Instead of rehearsing how others had wronged him, he began sending loving kindness to everyone who had caused him pain, recognizing that their harmful actions came from their own suffering. For mental clutter, Pema developed what he called cloud watching, observing his thoughts like clouds passing through an empty sky. Instead of believing every thought or following every worry, he learned to let them arise and dissolve naturally without attachment. The transformation was miraculous. As Pema released objects that no longer served him, his living space felt more peaceful. As he forgave old hurts, his heart felt lighter. As he stopped believing every anxious thought, his mind became clearer and more focused. When moving day finally arrived, Pema approached his single bag with excitement rather than dread. He packed 3 texts that had genuinely shaped his understanding, 1 photograph of his first teacher, and essential items for daily life. But he made a stunning discovery. He felt richer than when he'd owned hundreds of objects. "I thought I was losing my treasures," he told Master Nobu with tears of joy. "Instead, I found that I am the treasure." The other monks marveled at Pema's transformation. The man who had once been anxious and overwhelmed now radiated calm confidence. His teaching became more profound because it came from lived experience rather than theoretical knowledge. This story reveals Buddhism's revolutionary truth. External accumulation often reflects internal emptiness, while genuine fullness comes from knowing what we actually need. The practice of letting go isn't about living with less for its own sake. It's about creating space for what truly matters: peace, presence, and clarity. But as Pema discovered in his journey towards simplicity, clearing away the clutter of possessions emotions, and thoughts often reveals something we've been trying to avoid. Our own fears about the passage of time and what it means to grow older in a world that worships youth. Teaching 4. Let go of the fear of aging. In ancient India, there lived a woman whose beauty was so legendary that kings abandoned their thrones just to glimpse her face. Ambapali was the most celebrated court dancer in the land. Her movements were poetry, her smile could stop wars, and her youth seemed eternal. For 20 years, she lived as if beauty was her birthright and time was her servant. But time serves no one. The first grey hair appeared on her 35th birthday. Ambapali stared at it in her polished bronze mirror with the horror of someone discovering a death sentence. She plucked it immediately, but more followed. Then came the subtle lines around her eyes, the slight softening of her jawline, the way her body moved just a fraction slower than before. With each passing month, Ambapali felt not just physical changes, but existential terror. Her entire identity was built on being desired, admired, pursued. If her beauty faded, who would she be? What value would she have? The questions consumed her days and haunted her nights. She began avoiding mirrors, canceling performances, and spending fortunes on oils and treatments that promised to reverse time's effects. But the cruel truth remained. She was aging, and in her mind, aging meant dying while still alive. The fear became so overwhelming that Ambapali stopped leaving her chambers. She couldn't bear the thought of people seeing her changing face, comparing her to her younger self, whispering about her decline. She was living in a prison of her own terror. One morning, desperate and broken, she heard that the Buddha was teaching in a nearby grove. Something inside her, perhaps the last spark of hope, compelled her to disguise herself in simple robes and join the crowd of listeners. What she heard that day shattered everything she thought she knew about life. The Buddha was teaching about anicca, the fundamental truth of impermanence. All conditioned things are subject to decay, he said, his voice carrying infinite compassion. Aging is not a flaw in the system, it is the system itself. To resist aging is like a wave trying to resist returning to the ocean. But then he said something that pierced directly to Ambapali's wounded heart. Your beauty was never in your appearance. Your worth was never in your youth. These were merely temporary expressions of something eternal within you. After the teaching, Ambapali approached the Buddha privately. With tears streaming down her face, she confessed her terror of growing old, her attachment to her former beauty, and her despair about becoming invisible and worthless. The Buddha looked at her with eyes full of understanding and asked a question that changed her life. Tell me, when you were a child, were you not perfect then? When you became a maiden, were you not perfect then? When you reached your prime, were you not perfect then? And now, are you not perfect now? Ambapali stared at him, her mind reeling. She had never considered that perfection might not be about appearance at all. The Buddha continued, your attachment to youth is like a tree trying to remain a seed, or a butterfly mourning that it's no longer a caterpillar. Each stage of existence has its own beauty, its own purpose, its own perfect expression of life unfolding. This teaching revealed the Buddhist understanding of Tathagatagarbha, Buddha nature. Within every being exists an unchanging essence that is pure, complete, and worthy of love regardless of physical form. Age cannot touch this essence. It can only reveal it more clearly. But the Buddha offered Amberpali something even more transformative than acceptance. He taught her to see aging as a spiritual teacher. Each line on your face is a mark of wisdom earned, he explained. Each gray hair represents experience gathered. Each physical change invites you to discover inner strengths you never knew you possessed. He introduced her to the practice of Maranasati, mindfulness of death, not to create morbid thoughts, but to help her see the preciousness of each moment. When you fully accept that this body is temporary, he taught, you stop wasting time fearing its changes and start appreciating its faithful service. The Buddhist concept of virya, spiritual energy, revealed that true vitality doesn't diminish with age, it transforms. While physical energy may lessen, spiritual energy can actually increase, deepening our capacity for wisdom, compassion, and inner peace. Amberpali began to practice these teachings with the same dedication she'd once applied to her dancing. Instead of hiding her aging, she observed it with curiosity rather than horror. She noticed that while her physical flexibility had decreased, her emotional flexibility had grown. She could handle disappointments with greater grace, appreciate simple pleasures more deeply, and offer patience that her younger self had never possessed. She discovered the profound Buddhist truth of prajna wisdom that comes through lived experience. Each line on her face told stories of love given and received, challenges overcome, joys fully experienced. Her aging body was not evidence of decline, but proof of a life courageously lived. 6 months later, Amberpali made a decision that shocked the royal court. She became a Buddhist nun, donating all her wealth to support the Buddha's teachings. But this wasn't a retreat from life. It was an embracing of life's deeper purpose. The other nuns were initially skeptical of this former courtesan, but Amberpali's transformation was genuine and profound. She approached spiritual practice with the same intensity she'd once brought to her art, and her insights into impermanence became teachings that helped countless others. Her former beauty had attracted admirers for a few decades, but her hard-won wisdom touched lives for generations. She became known not for her fading appearance, but for her radiant peace and deep understanding of life's true nature. The Buddha later said of her, Amberpali has discovered the secret that eludes most humans, that aging is not something that happens to you, but something that blooms within you. She no longer fears time because she has become timeless. In her final years, visitors would seek out Amberpali not for her former fame, but for the profound serenity that emanated from her presence. They said something about being near her made them feel accepted, understood, and deeply seen, not despite her age, but because of the wisdom it had brought her. This story teaches us that fighting aging is like fighting gravity, exhausting and ultimately futile. But embracing aging with Buddhist understanding transforms it from a source of fear into a gateway to liberation. The most beautiful aspect of Amberpali's journey is what she discovered about true attractiveness. It comes not from smooth skin or youthful energy, but from the deep peace of someone who has learned to love themselves at every stage of existence. Think about your own relationship with aging. Are you spending precious energy fighting the natural flow of life? Or could you begin to see each change as an invitation to discover new forms of beauty, strength, and purpose? Because here's what Amberpali learned that transformed everything. When you stop fearing aging, you start living fully. And when you start living fully, you discover that your worth was never dependent on others' approval anyway. Which brings us to perhaps the most liberating realization of all. In ancient China, there lived a wealthy merchant named Li Wei who possessed everything society promised would bring happiness: a thriving silk business, a grand estate, respectful children, and the admiration of his community. Yet every morning, Li Wei woke with an ache in his chest he couldn't name, and every evening he went to bed feeling profoundly empty despite his day's successes. Li Wei had built his entire emotional world on a dangerous foundation: the belief that others would eventually make him happy. He waited endlessly for his wife to appreciate him more deeply, for his children to visit more often, for his business partners to truly acknowledge his contributions, and for his community to finally see his worth. Each day began with hope. Perhaps today someone would give him the validation, gratitude, or love that would fill the hollow space inside him. But each night ended in quiet disappointment as he realized that no matter how much he gave, how hard he worked, or how generously he provided, the fulfillment he craved remained just beyond reach. The pattern was exhausting. Li Wei would perform acts of kindness, then unconsciously keep score of the appreciation he received in return. He'd host elaborate dinners, then feel crushed when guests seemed distracted. He'd work tirelessly for his family's comfort, then resent their casual acceptance of his efforts. What tortured him most was the confusion. I have given so much to others, he would think. Why don't they make me happy in return? Why do I still feel so alone despite being surrounded by people who benefit from my generosity? One autumn day, overwhelmed by this inexplicable sadness, Li Wei heard about a wise Chan master named Huang Po who lived simply in the mountains. Desperate to understand why his prosperous life felt so hollow, he made the difficult journey to seek the master's wisdom. When Li Wei arrived at the humble temple, he poured out his story with raw honesty. "Master," he said, his voice breaking, "I have been generous to my family, fair to my employees, helpful to my neighbors. I've given them everything they could want. Why don't they fill the emptiness inside me? Why do I still feel so alone?" Master Huang Po listened with infinite patience, then asked Li Wei to help tend the temple garden. As they worked together in silence, the master pointed to a lotus flower blooming beside the path. "Tell me," Huang Po said gently, "does this flower bloom to make us happy?" "No, master," Li Wei replied, puzzled by the simple question. "It blooms because that's its nature." "And does it wither when we fail to notice its beauty?" "No, it follows its own cycle regardless of our attention." "Then," said Huang Po with a knowing smile, "you already understand the teaching." Li Wei stared at the flower, his mind racing. The master was showing him something revolutionary. The lotus didn't need external validation to fulfill its purpose. Its beauty, its worth, its very existence was complete unto itself. This pointed to the fundamental Buddhist principle of svatantra, self-dependence. The Buddha taught that true happiness cannot be given to us by others because it is our own inner nature, like the flower's natural blooming. When we expect others to make us happy, we are like someone standing in bright sunlight but waiting for others to light a candle for warmth. Over the following days, Master Huang Po introduced Li Wei to the Buddhist understanding of tanha, thirst, or craving. "Your unhappiness," the master explained, comes not from others failing you, but from your belief that they should complete you. This is like a cup demanding that the river fill it, while forgetting that the cup's purpose is to be useful when full and peaceful when empty. The master taught Li Wei about Attadipa being a lamp unto yourself. The Buddha's final words included this profound instruction: work out your own salvation with diligence. This doesn't mean isolation or selfishness, but taking complete responsibility for your own inner state. But Master, Li Wei protested, isn't it natural to want love and appreciation from others? Of course, Huang Po replied compassionately, but there's a crucial difference between enjoying love when it comes and demanding it for your happiness. One is like appreciating rain for your garden. The other is like dying of thirst in a desert while standing next to a well you refuse to use. The master introduced Li Wei to a revolutionary practice, Metta Bhavana, loving-kindness meditation, but with a twist. Instead of starting by sending love to others, Li Wei learned to cultivate genuine appreciation for himself first. Each morning, Huang Po instructed, sit quietly and ask yourself, what do I need today to feel at peace? Often, the answer is simple gratitude for your health, appreciation for your efforts, acknowledgement of your own good intentions. Learn to give yourself the recognition you've been waiting for others to provide. This wasn't narcissism or selfishness. It was recognizing his inherent worth independent of others' opinions. The Buddhist teaching of karuna, compassion, begins with self-compassion, not from selfishness, but because we can only give what we truly possess. Li Wei began practicing this daily. He started appreciating his own hard work instead of waiting for others to notice. He began enjoying his own company instead of feeling lonely when alone. He celebrated his own small victories instead of needing external validation. The transformation was gradual but profound. As Li Wei stopped depending on others for his emotional well-being, something beautiful happened. His relationships actually improved. When he interacted with his wife, he wasn't desperately seeking validation, but genuinely enjoying her company. When his children visited, he wasn't keeping score of their attention, but was fully present with them. The Buddhist principle of mudita, sympathetic joy, began flowering in Li Wei's heart. Because he was no longer emotionally dependent on others, he could celebrate their happiness without comparing it to his own needs. He found genuine pleasure in his wife's interests, his children's achievements, and his friends' successes. 6 months later, when Li Wei returned to thank Master Huang Po, his entire demeanor had changed. His face carried a peaceful contentment that hadn't been there before. I understand now, he told the master with deep gratitude. When I stopped waiting for others to make me happy, I discovered I had the capacity for happiness all along. I just couldn't see it because I was looking in the wrong direction. Master Huang Po smiled knowingly. This is the great paradox of Buddhist teaching. When you stop needing others to love you, you become someone who is naturally easy to love. When you stop demanding happiness from outside, you discover the happiness that was always within. But the Master offered one final, crucial teaching. Remember, this doesn't mean becoming isolated or cold. True emotional independence creates space for genuine connection. When you're not grasping for love, you can receive it freely. When you're not demanding appreciation, you can give it generously. Li Wei lived the rest of his life with this understanding. He continued to cherish his relationships, but from a place of fullness rather than neediness. He gave love freely because he had it in abundance, not because he hoped to receive it in return. As he often told others in his later years, "I spent half my life waiting for others to hand me happiness, not realizing I was already holding the key." The greatest gift you can give your loved ones is your own inner peace, because then your love becomes a blessing rather than a burden. But Li Wei's journey to emotional independence revealed something else that many struggle with as they watch the next generation's energy and achievements: the painful habit of measuring their present worth against youthful standards that no longer apply. Teaching 6. Let go of comparing yourself to the young. In feudal Japan, there lived a legendary swordsman named Takeshi, whose name was whispered with reverence across the land. For 20 years, he had been undefeated in duels, his blade moving with such speed and precision that opponents often surrendered before crossing swords. Students traveled from distant provinces to learn from him, and his dojo was considered the finest in all of Japan. But time is the one opponent no warrior can defeat. At 55, Takeshi began noticing changes that filled him with dread. His lightning-fast reflexes had become merely quick. His endurance, once limitless, now required careful management. Most torturous of all, he watched his young students' warriors barely half his age, moving with the fluid grace and boundless energy he remembered possessing. Every training session became an exercise in hidden humiliation. Takeshi would demonstrate techniques and notice his students politely averting their eyes when his movements lacked their former perfection. He began avoiding sparring matches, making excuses about focusing on theory rather than risk the crushing embarrassment of being outmatched by warriors young enough to be his children. The comparisons consumed his thoughts like poison. "I used to move like lightning," he'd think bitterly while watching a 20-year-old student execute a perfect sequence. "My strikes once had the power of thunder. Now I'm just an old man pretending to be relevant." The psychological torture became so intense that Takeshi considered abandoning his life's work entirely. What was the point of being a master who could no longer master his own limitations? One evening, as he sat alone in his empty training hall, surrounded by swords he felt too ashamed to wield, an unexpected visitor appeared at his door. An elderly Zen monk named Isai stood in the doorway, his weathered face radiating a peace that seemed impossible given his advanced age. "Master Takeshi," the monk said with deep respect, "I've come not to learn your sword technique, but to understand your sword heart." "My sword heart?" Takeshi responded with bitter laughter. "What heart remains? I can barely keep pace with students half my age. My sword heart died with my speed." Without asking permission, Monk Isai picked up one of Takeshi's practice swords. What happened next defied everything Takeshi thought he understood about martial arts. The old monk began moving with the weapon, but his style was completely unlike any fighting form Takeshi had ever witnessed. His movements were slow, deliberate, flowing like deep water rather than striking like lightning. Yet there was something profoundly powerful and beautiful in the monk's demonstration, a presence that filled the room with dignity rather than force. "What style is this?" Takeshi asked, genuinely intrigued despite his pain. "This is the way of the mountain," Aisai replied simply. "The young river rushes and crashes, making much noise and carving quick channels. But the mountain remains solid, eternal, shaping the entire landscape through patience rather than speed." This introduction touched on the Buddhist teaching of Kshanti, patient endurance, not as passive waiting, but as a different kind of strength that only emerges through lived experience. Over the following weeks, Aisai became Teikshi's most unusual teacher. He introduced the swordsman to the Buddhist concept of prajna, wisdom that transcends mere technical knowledge. "Your young students possess speed and strength," the monk explained one morning as they watched the dawn practice session. "But they lack something you now carry in abundance, the deep understanding that comes only through decades of facing both victory and defeat, triumph and limitation." Aisai taught Teikshi about the Zen principle of wabi-sabi, finding profound beauty in imperfection and impermanence. "The most treasured tea bowls in our ceremonies are not flawlessly smooth," the monk said, showing Teikshi an ancient, cracked cup. "They have irregularities, asymmetries, visible signs of age and use. These flaws are what make them priceless, because they tell stories of service, of time weathered with grace, of a life fully lived." The breakthrough came during a meditation session when Teikshi experienced a moment of startling clarity. He realized something that revolutionized his entire perspective. His young students couldn't do what he could do. They couldn't teach with his depth of experience. They couldn't spot subtle mistakes with his trained eye. They couldn't guide struggling students with his patient understanding. And they certainly couldn't demonstrate the kind of inner calm that comes only from surviving countless challenges. This reflected the Buddhist teaching of Svadharma, your unique path and purpose. Each stage of life has its own gifts, its own forms of mastery that cannot be replicated by any other stage. Aisai introduced Teikshi to the practice of vipassana, clear seeing. Through daily meditation, Teikshi learned to observe his thoughts of comparison without being consumed by them. When you watch a soaring eagle and compare it to a swimming fish, the monk explained, you miss the perfect mastery each creature displays in its own element. The transformation was gradual but profound. Teikshi began to see his slower movements not as failures, but as the result of accumulated wisdom about when to act and when to conserve energy. His reduced speed was balanced by increased precision. He no longer wasted motion on unnecessary flourishes. More importantly, he discovered that his students weren't secretly mocking his limitations. They were genuinely hungry for the depth of knowledge only experience could provide. When he stopped hiding behind demonstrations of physical prowess and began sharing the profound insights he'd gained through decades of practice, his teaching reached levels of impact he'd never achieved in his prime. Teikshi learned to embody the Buddhist understanding that life unfolds in seasons, each with its own purpose and beauty. Spring brings explosive growth and boundless energy. Summer offers full flowering and peak performance. But autumn and winter have their own gifts, the deep wisdom of harvest, the quiet strength of endurance, the profound beauty of acceptance. The most beautiful part of Teikshi's transformation was watching him mentor his youngest, most talented student, a warrior whose natural ability far exceeded anything Teikshi had possessed at that age. Instead of feeling threatened or diminished, Takeshi felt profound joy in nurturing potential that surpassed his own. "This boy will achieve things I never could," he told Isai with genuine pride. "And that is exactly as it should be. My role now is not to compete with the young, but to ensure they have the wisdom to use their gifts well." Years later, when that young student became Japan's most celebrated swordsman, he would tell everyone that his greatest teacher was not the warrior who moved fastest, but the master who had learned to move with the depth and dignity that only comes with age. Takeshi lived his final decades not as a faded shadow of his former self, but as something entirely new, a sage whose very presence conveyed the profound peace of someone who had learned to honor every season of existence. But as Takeshi discovered in learning to embrace his current stage of life, there was one more weight he needed to release, the heaviest burden many carry as they age, the crushing weight of past mistakes and the belief that redemption is no longer possible. Teaching 7, let go of regret, forgive yourself for the past. In ancient India, there lived a woman whose past was so shameful that she couldn't speak her own name without flinching. Kisugatami had once been a respected merchant's wife, but a series of devastating choices had destroyed everything she held dear. A business decision made in desperation had bankrupted not only her family, but also her brother's household. Her prideful refusal to seek help had led to her young son's death from a treatable illness. Her bitter words during grief had driven away her husband, leaving her completely alone. For 7 years, Kisugatami lived as an outcast, surviving on scraps and charity, but the physical hunger was nothing compared to the relentless anguish that devoured her from within. Every morning, she woke to the same torturous inner voice. "You killed your son. You destroyed your family. You deserve this suffering. You are beyond redemption." The weight of regret had become her constant companion, heavier than any physical burden. She would replay each catastrophic decision endlessly, torturing herself with thoughts of what could have been different, what she should have done, how she could have prevented the cascade of tragedy that defined her existence. Kisugatami had become a living ghost, haunted not by spirits, but by the relentless prosecution of her own conscience. One morning, desperate and hollow-eyed, she heard that the Buddha was teaching in a nearby grove. She almost didn't go. What could a holy teacher possibly say to someone as tainted as her? But something deeper than hope, perhaps simple desperation, compelled her to hide at the back of the crowd. The Buddha's first words that day seemed to pierce directly through her armor of self-hatred. There is no person alive who has not made choices they regret. The question is not whether you have caused harm, but whether you will learn to transform that harm into wisdom, that pain into compassion. After the teaching, Kisugatami approached the Buddha with trembling hands. Through tears of shame, she confessed everything, the selfish decisions, the pride that had prevented her from seeking help, the harsh words that had driven away love, the crushing responsibility she felt for her son's death. "Master," she whispered, "I have destroyed everything I touched. I killed my own child through stubbornness. I ruined families through greed. What wisdom could possibly exist for someone like me? How can someone so stained ever find peace?" The Buddha's response would forever change how she understood forgiveness and redemption. "Tell me," he said gently, "when a seed falls into manure, does the lotus refuse to grow? When muddy water settles, does it not become clear? The deepest wisdom often emerges from the darkest places, not despite the darkness, but because of what the darkness teaches us. This introduced Kisargotami to the Buddhist teaching of transformation through understanding. The Buddha explained that regret, when approached with wisdom, becomes the soil for compassion. Our deepest mistakes can become our greatest teachers if we are willing to learn from them rather than simply punish ourselves for them. Your son's death was not your fault alone, the Buddha continued with infinite tenderness. It was the result of countless conditions, illness, poverty, lack of knowledge, societal limitations, and yes, choices made from fear rather than wisdom. To take complete responsibility for outcomes shaped by so many factors is not humility. It is a form of spiritual pride that keeps you trapped in suffering. He taught her about the Buddhist concept of pratityasamutpada, dependent origination, which reveals that every event arises from multiple interconnected causes, not from a single person's actions. This doesn't eliminate personal responsibility, but it places our choices within the larger web of existence, allowing for both accountability and compassion. The Buddha introduced Kisargotami to a practice that would gradually heal her tormented heart. Tonglen meditation, taking and giving. Instead of drowning in her own guilt, she learned to breathe in the suffering of all parents who had lost children, all people who had made devastating mistakes, all beings trapped in cycles of regret and self-punishment. When you transform your individual pain into universal compassion, the Buddha taught, your suffering becomes meaningful. Your mistakes become bridges to understanding others' struggles. But the most revolutionary teaching came when the Buddha asked her to consider a profound question. If a friend came to you carrying the same burdens you carry, speaking to themselves with the same cruelty you use against yourself, what would you say to them? Kisargotami realized with shocking clarity that she would offer that friend boundless compassion, understanding, and forgiveness. She would see their humanity beyond their mistakes, their inherent worth despite their failures, their capacity for redemption regardless of their past. Then why, the Buddha asked softly, do you refuse to give yourself the same mercy you would freely offer another? This question cracked open something that had been frozen in Kisargotami's heart for 7 years. She began to understand the Buddhist teaching that true forgiveness is not forgetting or excusing harmful actions. It is remembering without the poison of self-hatred, learning without the burden of eternal punishment. The Buddha taught her that genuine remorse serves a purpose. It shows us that our actions matter, that we have grown beyond who we were when we caused harm, and that we are committed to making different choices. But endless self-torture serves no one, not ourselves, not those we've harmed, not the world that needs our wisdom and service. Over the following months, Kisargotami practiced a daily ritual of self-forgiveness. Each morning, she would acknowledge her past mistakes without minimizing them, feel genuine remorse without drowning in it, and then consciously choose to use her painful wisdom to prevent others from suffering similarly. She began working with other women who had lost children, offering them the understanding that only someone who had walked that path could provide. Her own tragedy became a source of healing for others, transforming her regret into purposeful service. The most beautiful part of Kisugatami's transformation was not that she forgot her past, but that she learned to carry it differently. Her mistakes became not weights that crushed her, but teachers that deepened her compassion and wisdom. Years later, when people would seek her counsel about their own regrets and self-condemnation, she would share the teaching that had liberated her. The Buddha taught that we suffer not because we make mistakes, but because we refuse to learn from them and move forward. The past cannot be changed, but your relationship with the past can be transformed. She would often say to those drowning in regret, "You are not the worst thing you have ever done. You are not permanently defined by your biggest mistake. You are a being capable of growth, learning, and contributing something beautiful to this world. But only if you stop punishing yourself long enough to discover who you're becoming." Kisugatami lived her remaining years not as someone trying to escape her past, but as someone who had learned to alchemize pain into wisdom, regret into service, and personal suffering into universal compassion. But her journey towards self-forgiveness revealed one final truth that many struggle with as they age: the persistent whisper that it's somehow too late to change, to grow, to become someone new. This last lie, perhaps the most insidious of all, would require one final act of liberation. Here we are, at the end of our journey together, and perhaps you feel something different than when we began. Maybe your shoulders are a little lighter. Maybe that invisible backpack of burdens feels less crushing. Maybe, for the first time in years, you sense that real freedom is actually possible. We've walked through 8 profound teachings that have liberated souls for over 2,500 years. You've met Master Chen, who discovered that emptying his cup created space for infinite wisdom. Tanzan, who learned that protecting your peace isn't selfish, it's sacred. Ambapali, who found that aging reveals beauty that youth could never possess. Li Wei, who realized happiness was never someone else's job to provide. Each story gave you a key. 8 keys to unlock doors you might not have known were locked. But here's the beautiful truth: you don't need to use all 8 keys at once. Choose the one story that hit you like lightning. Choose the one burden that feels ready to be released. Remember what that 78-year-old monk taught me: most people spend their lives in a prison where the door was never actually locked. You have the power to walk free. If even one teaching touched something deep inside you, drop that word in the comments, the one thing you're ready to release. Not for me, but as your declaration of freedom. Your journey to lightness begins now. And it's never, ever too late to begin. Welcome to the rest of your life.